I want to get into, of course, today my main lecture, which, of course, you see that video. One of the things we'll talk about today is the Olympics, which most of this lecture is going to be like on kind of like classical Greek culture, which the Olympics, one of the main things I'll kind of talk about, probably half of it. And the rest of it I'll get into, talk about also the arts a little bit. We haven't really talked about drama much, which is something that the Greeks are famous for. I'll talk a little bit about Greek philosophy, some of the famous philosophers that they had. Then we'll get into mythology. One of the last things I'll talk about the different gods that are, of course, associated with the Greco-Roman mythologies that are kind of around. So anyway, let me first go ahead and talk about the Olympics, which, of course, you saw from that little short video how the Olympics is something that it's been around for quite a long time. In fact, I think it was around for, I want to say, almost 1,200 years. They actually had it in ancient times. Romans got rid of it, and then, of course, it was brought back in modern times just recently, 100-something years ago in the late 19th century. The Olympics, of course, they believe started in 776 BC. That's the traditional date that they put it at when the Olympics started a long time ago. Of course, one of several, by the way, public games that the ancient Greeks were known for. They actually had 5, believe it or not, that were kind of put on in the Greek world. But the one that's the Olympic Games held at Olympia, I'll get to in a second, was the oldest one, and I guess the one that lasted the longest over many years. I'll kind of give you a list here, but these are actually the 5 they had at one point. They had the one that we're talking about, which is the Olympics, ancient Olympics, which were held at Olympia in the Peloponnese Peninsula. They had some other ones, so below you see Panathenaic Games, were held at Athens, which honored the gods Pan and Athena, which were kind of prestigious. Pythian Games were held at the city-state of Delphi in Boeotia. That honored the famous oracle named Pythia. You heard of her. The Nemean Games were held at Argos, and you also see the Isthmian Games were held at Corinth. So they had all these other games that they put on in Greece. But the one that's the most famous, of course, overall, was the one, of course, associated with Olympia, with the Olympics. I think I've got another slide showing it right here. But the Olympic Games with that one, those are the years it was held from. They believe at one point 776 BC, and then they think 393 CE may have been one of the last years it was held before it was banned by the Romans over time. And held at Olympia, which Olympia, by the way, like I said, is up in the, it's kind of like in the northwestern part of the Peloponnese Peninsula, like the southern part of Greece is about where it is. And it was held every 4 summers, like that slide says, of course, to honor the god Zeus. It was kind of like a religious festival, like they were talking about in the video. That was the chief god. Oh, by the way, they called it Olympiad, by the way. Every 4 summers was a kind of I guess, a chronological term they would use in like a calendar. So every 4 years, they would call a Olympic truce between the different city-states. And then athletes would come there to Olympia where they would honor Zeus. He had a huge temple that was there. That was built. I think I've got an image of that too. I've added for you to look at right here. But Temple of Zeus at Olympia, you see on the right there. Athletes would actually have to go before the god Zeus, his statue that was there, and say that they had actually trained for like at least 10 months as whatever athlete they're, I guess, competing in, whatever event. And so I think I told you that the temple had been originally built by this famous architect and sculptor named Phidias, who built the huge statue that was in it of Zeus. That's where the temple was originally, right there. So predominantly it was mostly religious festivals that became like sporting events, and of course lasted about 5 days, was how long usually the Olympics lasted in ancient times. I think I've got some other images right here. That's actually the ancient site of Olympia that you're looking at. So you can see at the top, I don't know if you see that or not, that's where the main stadium was, the Stadium of Olympia, where they had some events like running and so on. There's other public buildings that are part of that, which I guess buildings were part of the agora, I guess they had at Olympia. Let's see, also got here's kind of an image showing you the actual stadium, which is kind of still there. The actual track where a lot of running competitions, I guess, would take place. You can see where the runners would start in the front right there. You can also see kind of in the back there, there's an area where judges would sit to watch the events and judge them. I think I've got other images showing how a lot of athletes would run through this vaulted tunnel as they come out onto the playing field of the actual stadium. Think about some other images right here, kind of showing you also the stadium at Olympia that was there. I guess there must have been seating around it at one point, but it's all, of course, gone now. By the way, like a lot of the events, if you know about the Olympics, they were all done in the nude. They didn't wear any clothes. There's different theories on why they did that. I think one theory is that the Greeks kind of thought the human body was something that, the gods had created, so they wanted to be able to honor, the gods, by running around naked, that kind of thing. I think another theory too is that if you know about the games, they were segregated. The men had their own games, the main Olympic games. And then the women had their own games, which honored the goddess Hera, because there was a temple there for Hera as well. They're called sometimes the Heraean Games, if you know that. But they were mostly running events. I think I heard a theory that they were naked so they would know they were men and women. So I think there was a case where even some women had tried to participate in some of the men's games, and they banned that. I think a lot of cases, women weren't allowed to watch the games, especially women that were, I think, married, couldn't watch the games. And I think the ones in the Heraean Games, only single women could participate. I've got some things here kind of showing you like some of the events that they did have that were kind of famous sports that were associated with the games. Pentathlon, by the way, was one of the most famous that the Greeks created, which was this 5-sport event where you would participate. You see down there the discus throw, Greco-Roman wrestling, a foot race, which is kind of like 100 meters, basically, long jump, and then the javelin competition as well. You can see an image right there at the top here, where I'll just show you right here. Long jump, they would use these weights in their hands to help propel themselves forward. And so that's the origin of where the long jump started, was actually within the actual pentathlon, five events that you would compete. And I guess whoever did the best in all 5 would win the event. If you did, by the way, win an event, usually they would give you like a crown of olive leaves, like around your head. I think sometimes you even get a statue of yourself they would put up at the actual Olympia. I think, or even like you'll even see sometimes these jugs that they would have, which will have like stuff inscribed on, like I guess artwork on it, like showing like the events, and they might get that too, which might have olive oil in it, which is kind of like money. Chariot racing was real popular too, as well. Chariot racing, if you know about it, was a very popular sport within the Greco-Roman world. Like the Romans had it, like the Circus Maximus in Rome. Under the Byzantine Empire, or Eastern Roman Empire, they had the Hippodrome, famous track, of course, in Constantinople, where horse racing and chariot racing took place. And most chariot racing was usually using a team of 4 horses with chariots. And they were kind of popular because they were, very dangerous, thrilling. People would get killed a lot and things like that. And so I think chariot racing was probably the most popular sport, probably, I want to say Mediterranean worldwide. Of course, they had traditional running, which they say running events were the first events that really started at the Olympics a long time ago. Pancration, you may have heard of, is another type of sport that the Greeks invented, which pancration was kind of a cross between boxing and wrestling, where there were kind of like limited rules, and I think in some cases you can bite each other's ears off and things like that. But pancration was one of several examples of blood sports that the Greeks had, which the other blood sports were, of course, wrestling and boxing as well. Greco-Roman wrestling, which I, of course, also talked about already, was, of course, another sport that was also famous. Which I think I told you that a lot of these sports, like boxing, wrestling, probably went back to like Minoan times originally. Discus throw, as well, of course, another famous sport in the Olympics. And then the javelin is another sport. Some of these sports, were probably derived from warfare. Over time, like the javelin, which I think a javelin was like easily about, I want to say 3 to 5 feet long, kind of like a short spear, which you would throw. There is one sport that's real famous that was kind of comical. They had, it was called the hoplitodromos race, or simply just hoplite race, which a lot of hoplites would participate in. And so you'd wear your armor, your helmet and everything, I guess you wear for battle, greaves, and you would actually participate in an actual, like a run. So it's like kind of like a 100 meters kind of race, but they're wearing armor. So I think they added that later, maybe 6th century BC, but it's kind of one of these races which were kind of comical. Now, also, I told you how the women had their own sports. Which the Temple of Hera, of course, temple that was at Olympia, was also built there on site. And Hera, remember, was the wife of course, Zeus. And so they had games for the women to participate in as well. They call it the Heraean Games, is what it was nicknamed. And so women, like I said, had their own segregated sports, but mostly they were just running sports, and not some of the other sports like the men had. Now, what happened over time, if you know about the Olympics, they were banned because of the Romans. The Romans, if you know about it, they banned it because of Christianity. Christianity was starting to spread throughout the whole empire. And Theodosius the First, or sometimes called Theodosius the Great, as well, had become the emperor of the whole. I think if you know about that time, the Roman Empire was splitting into two empires, Western and an Eastern Roman Empire. And Theodosius actually, I think for a short time, for a few years, ruled the whole thing. And so he decided to ban the Olympics because he kind of saw it as this pagan spectacle. And so the year they think it was banned, of course, was in the year 393 BC. You can see, I'll kind of show it right here with that. And that they think he did it to promote Christianity was the reason for it, because he was trying to, convert everybody to Christianity, ban all these different pagan religions. And I guess people running around naked and, worshiping still like the god, I guess he called Jupiter by that time. They kind of thought it's kind of awkward thing. And so they banned it after that. So I guess by 394 and after, you couldn't participate in those games anymore. So like I said, the games were around for almost like 1,200 years. It's a long time, not quite. I think it's a little, maybe 1,160 something thousand. Yeah, I think it's 1,167 maybe, how many years it is actually. But yeah, he bans the games, and so they don't really have any other games like that until modern times. When you get the famous modern Olympics that get started in 1896, and They think that part of why the Europeans developed the modern Olympics to create camaraderie among nations, because if you know about Europe going back to not just the 19th century, but previous centuries before that, they had fought numerous wars against each other. You can probably go back to like the 30 Years' War, 7 Years' War, and all these other wars that were breaking out, Napoleonic Wars, etc. And so it was kind of a way for nations to kind of come together, compete in sports, and might be the closest thing you can get maybe to almost like creating world peace through using sports and things like that. So Athens was chosen as the first Olympic Games, which are considered the first summer games that were participated, because winter games weren't added till later. And as you can see, it was held in April of 1896. 14 nations participated, which most of them were from Europe, although the United States participated in the first modern games in that year. And kind of got some images kind of showing it right here. But here you go, 14 countries participated, 43 events, and there were about 241 athletes that participated in the 1896 Athens Summer Games. That, by the way, is one of the stadiums that they built for the 1896 Olympic Games, which is called the Panathenaic Stadium. They held some events there like running, I think also cycling, and a few other events were also held there overall. And by the way, Greece, believe it or not, the Kingdom of Greece at the time, they won the most medals, which was 47. United States won the most gold medals, 11. But they had all kinds of sports that they had there, from like wrestling, they had cycling, they had swimming, you name some kind of sport. I think they even had tennis or something, like tennis being played. And I thought they had like golf or something, like some of these early Olympics that they had in the summer games. I think rowing, like those rowboats and things like that. So all kinds of kind of sports were added. I guess with some of the Greek ones they already had at the time. But they'll add winter games. That's one thing, about the Olympics. I think in the 1930s, they start adding like winter games as well. They kind of alternate, the summer and the winter games every 2 years. Of course, today the Olympics now is more commercialized. It's become more professionalized, since the late 20th century. There's been a lot of controversies, of course, about the modern Olympics, like doping, and I think some of the judges, being bribed and things like that, which I think back then they did that too. Like bribing judges was something that was kind of, I think, that went on. And I know there was a case where I think it was in I want to say 60 something AD, I want to say 66 or 67 AD. There was a case where Emperor Nero entered some of the Olympic Games events, which I think the main one he did was the chariot race. And I think a bunch of other events too. And he won it because he was the emperor. Nobody wanted to just give him like second place or whatever. So anyway, that's the so-called Olympic Games. Now let me get to next. Now I want to talk about as well a little bit about drama, like drama plays, which of course the Greeks were kind of known for. The Greeks were known for putting on plays, which the most famous that they had was the tragedy, or the tragic play. It's the one that they preferred. They didn't like comic type plays, like people like comedy today and satires and things like that, in the modern world. But they like serious plays. The Greeks were serious people, and a lot of the plays, usually there was a case where the main character, something happened to him, like he had a downfall, or something tragic happens to him. He dies, or he blinds himself, or something occurs. And there aren't too many dramatists from ancient times. So I've kind of got them here, be listed right there, but there's only four that have survived from ancient times. Aeschylus, which you see there, Sophocles, which is probably the one that's the most best one, Euripides, and then Aristophanes, of course, is the fourth one. So there's only four that have survived from ancient times. The first three, by the way, were all dramatists that wrote tragic plays. And then Aristophanes was more of a comic type playwright. To kind of give you, comparison between those dramatists right there. Let me first talk about Aeschylus, though. Aeschylus was considered, if you know about him, he was the father of the Greek tragedy. They think he was the one that wrote the first tragic plays in the Greek world. Most of these playwrights mostly wrote in the 5th century BC or around that time. He's also, by the way, the father of the trilogy, which a trilogy, is like a 3-part play, or I guess a movie it could be now. But he was one of the first to actually do that. And his most famous series of plays he wrote was called Orestia, which was a series of plays about the house of Atreus, like the family of like Agamemnon. It talks about the period after the Trojan War. And I think its most famous play out of that trilogy is the one called Agamemnon. But it goes into the story of how Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, had him killed through one of her lovers. And then later what happened was the son of Agamemnon, his name is Orestes, would eventually kill Clytemnestra. And there's like a trial, associated with that. And that's kind of the story of basically about the house of Atreus that ruled Mycenae, which is, I guess, happened sometime maybe close to the 13th century. So that's who Aeschylus is, so-called father of the trilogy. That's kind of well known today. Then they got another, of course, famous dramatist, playwright, Sophocles, of course, of the Greek playwrights. He wrote up to 120 plays, which I think was the most at one point, but only 7 actually survived from ancient times. It's a case where a lot of these playwrights wrote a lot of plays, but not that many survived from a long time ago. His most famous, you can see there, is the play Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King. It's called. You may have heard of that particular play. And it's considered, by the way, Oedipus Rex is considered to be the greatest classical play written in ancient times. It's been put on many times. There's even been reworkings of it. I want to say Voltaire, I want to say in the 18th century, did a reworking of a French version of it called Oedipe. That's famous. And it concerns the story of Oedipus, who was the king of Thebes. And if you know about the story, a lot of irony in it. He ends up killing his father and marrying his mother. So a lot of plays have a lot of irony in it. If you watch or read various plays that are out there. They also got Medea as well, which is another play by Euripides. Euripides was the last of the Greek dramatist type playwrights, and he wrote like up to 95 plays, you can see, but 18 survive. If I can be straight about all the 4 playwrights in ancient Greece, he had the most that survived. It's part of why he becomes popular later. And he's got more plays. In fact, by the Hellenistic times, Hellenistic age, he's the preferred playwright compared to Sophocles, who was probably better, But yeah, Medea is a famous play, which is kind of based on that myth about Jason. You may have heard of Jason the Argonauts, which is kind of famous in Greek mythology. And Jason had married this princess named Medea. However, he wanted to divorce her and marry a younger woman. And Medea got angry and killed their children. And supposedly the play is kind of about a divorce in a certain way. So yeah, Medea is a famous play. He also wrote other plays. The Bacchae, I think, is a famous play he wrote. The Trojan Women, Hippolytus, and Electra. Those are other plays that were written by Euripides, mostly around the 5th century too. Then they got Aristophanes also. He's a very famous playwright that's known for writing comic type plays. In fact, they consider Aristophanes to be what they call the father of comedy. So he's the one that first kind of created the idea of creating plays where they make fun of people, make fun of society, or culture in general. And so he's one of the first to actually do that, Aristophanes. He did have several plays that were famous, that were well known. One I think is now considered his most famous is the one you see there called Lysistrata, which Lysistrata was a type of anti-war play which took place with the backdrop of the Peloponnesian War. And there was a case where the women were tired of the men going off to fight war, I guess against Sparta. And so this woman named Lysistrata, Athenian woman, decided to start what they call a sex strike, where they would sex with their men. And so that was the plot of the whole story of, I guess, what Lysistrata was about. He had other plays too, by the way. I'll get to Greek philosophy in a second, but other plays he had too that were famous. He had another play called The Clouds that's well known. I think I've got a list of them right here if you want to look at them if you go back, but there should be a list of plays that he had. The Clouds is a famous, I think that one's a play about kind of a satire of like intellectuals, like making fun of like Socrates and other, I guess intelligent people at the time. He's also got a place called The Frogs, The Birds. I think there's another play called The Wasps that he also wrote also. So if you think about plays today in general, like the Greek play and all that, it has had an influence on like later plays. I know William Shakespeare wrote a lot of plays which were likely influenced by the Greeks, like tragic plays like Julius Caesar or something like that, or Romeo and Juliet. Were probably plays that were kind of influenced by some of the Greek plays a long time ago. I'll get to it later, but we'll talk about mythology, because a lot of these plays, they do kind of bring in mythology stories, gods and things like that into a lot of plays and drama, and so that's something they did do in ancient times. But let me move on to talk about also Greek philosophy as well. The Greeks were also known for being one of the ones that first kind of influenced Western philosophy, which would influence like the Roman thought, medieval thought, and of course also modern European Western thought as well. And they do think that the word philosophy is from Greek originally. If I can put it on the screen for you, but the word philosophy originates from the word you see below, philosophos, which means love of wisdom or love of knowledge. And so a lot of ideas in Western philosophy originate with the Greeks a long time ago. Especially, I think, Plato's type brand of philosophy, Platonic or Platonism philosophy, probably was the most influential, but there were other philosophers that also had an impact on the West as well. They do think that the first philosopher, at least in Greece, was a man named Thales of Miletus, who lived in Western Turkey between the 7th and the 6th centuries BC. He's considered to be the father of Greek philosophy, but also the father of, they think, early science in Greece. And he did stuff with math, astronomy, science. And so they think he's the one that kind of gave birth to, especially mathematics, in ancient Greece at the time. Of course, if you study about, you know, Greek philosophy, the one philosopher that's considered one of the most famous is Socrates, who lived around the 5th century BC. Kind of show that right here, the slide. And yeah, he is considered the first major Greek philosopher that you see in ancient Greece. He even opened his own philosophical school in Athens at one point. And he is this type of philosopher that other people kind of copy, like emulate, like Plato and I guess Aristotle and others that follow afterwards. And he is known for his different kinds of methods of teaching. One method he was well known for, if you know about, is the so-called dialectic method or Socratic method. And the Socratic method was a type of cooperative, argumentative dialogue where he and his students would sit around and he would ask them questions, and I guess whatever answer he would get from them, they could then stimulate some kind of critical thinking between them. And so it's something that he kind of developed, which became part of a lot of educational pedagogy, which are kind of still used today in education in different fields. You can see he was known for different sayings or maxims that he was known for. The unexamined life is not worth living. It's probably one of his most famous quotes he's very famous for. Also, the one right there, which both of those are in the Apology of Socrates, written by Plato. He was one of his best students. He has a very famous quote where he says, "One thing only I know, and that is that I know nothing." And supposedly at the time when Socrates lived in Greece, he was considered to be the most intelligent man of Greece. I think according to the Oracle of Delphi in Boeotia, but he thought he didn't know anything, or I guess he couldn't know everything, that kind of thing. But Socrates was highly influential, so much that I guess in Athens that they accused him of corrupting a lot of the young people. And so if you know what happened to Socrates, he was put on trial for, I think, two things. One, for corrupting the youth of Athens, but I think there's another theory that he was trying to bring in other kinds of gods or false gods into Athens. And at the time when this was going on, Athens had lost the war to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. And so Socrates was kind of like a scapegoat for, I guess, the fact that Athens was declining at the time. And so he was put on trial and found guilty. And he was, I think, given a choice. He could either take poison, hemlock, or I think he had another choice where he could just leave, like go into exile, which they would allow. But he refused to do that. So he took poison instead. That's a famous painting, by the way, done by Jacques-Louis David. He's a famous French painter. I think he did that painting, I want to say, in 1787. But there's been a lot of images, showing Socrates. It's kind of romanticized, I guess, about it. But it's supposed to be like, I guess, the last day when he, takes the poison at that point. But I think he could have escaped. I think his friends could have let him escape or something like that. But he just refused and took poison, of course, instead. So Socrates is kind of a tragic figure in Greek history. You've also got Plato as well. Plato is really considered to be the best philosopher in ancient Greece and probably likely the most influential in the end. He's really the most influential in Western philosophy. In fact, they often call it a brand of philosophy called Platonic philosophy, or Platonism, I think is another name that they dub it as well. And Plato, if you know about it, was one of Socrates' best students that was under him. And he also was one of like one or two men that wrote down a lot of the main dialogues of Socrates and his students, which Socrates never wrote anything down. if you know about that. And one thing he's very famous for, this image, about 385 BC, you can see there, he founded a philosophical school at Athens, which is called the Academy. And this particular school was considered, by the way, to be one of the first major schools of higher learning, which would be kind of like a university. It would be kind of equivalent today, where they taught all kinds of subjects, whether it be, ethics, metaphysics, politics, rhetoric, science, math, the arts, military sciences. They pretty much taught everything. And so it's a very important, school, because it influenced a lot of Greco-Roman thought over time, probably even influenced Christian thought as well. And it was around till 86 BC when the Romans closed it under the dictator Sulla. So anyway, yeah, he's really a very, very important philosopher. And he does have several books that he writes, of course, which I think a lot of these books that are published later from different Greek philosophers are really kind of like lecture notes from like teaching his students. Those are his two most famous works he was famous for, which were the Apology of Socrates. And then the other big one, of course, was called the Republic as well. By the way, the name Academy, like the name of that school, that's where you get a lot of the terms academics, academia, which it's really interesting about the name. It actually was derived from a person's name, a Greek hero, I think went back to, I want to say, Greek mythology, named Academos. That was the name that he chose to call his school, named it after him, basically. Oh yeah, Plato, like I said, has got different works, and they have actually, you'll sometimes see images like the School of Athens, which is a very famous painting done by Raphael da Sanzio during the Renaissance. It'll depict, I think in the middle you've got Plato and Aristotle right there, who were at one point teaching together at that school, and then all these different people that are kind of there learning, or teachers that were also there at that actual school. So sometimes they'll call it that, the School of Athens, or something like that as well. By the way, that book you're looking at there, The Republic, that particular book is probably his most famous philosophical work. It's actually a work on political science. In fact, it was one of the first probably works that was considered like what we call a political treatise, where it kind of goes into ideals of what good government should be, politics or society. And so Plato is kind of considered like a father of political science with his influence. However, kind of funny about the name, the book is called The Republic, but he didn't really favor like a republic or a democracy. Plato thought that the best actual form of government is a monarchy, an educated monarch. I think he called it sometimes a philosopher king. Yeah, the School of Athens, sometimes a nickname for the Academy. I'll get to it later, but there is a rival school to it that's called the Lyceum that kind of taught similar type subjects. Now, you've also got Aristotle as well. He's also another great Greek philosopher of the time. In fact, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are kind of sometimes called the so-called Big Three because they're so important in Greek philosophy. But he's important as well. He lived between 384 to 322 BC. Actually came from northern Greece, like around where Macedonia is today. And at one point, he was a student under Plato, in fact, one of Plato's best students. And he ended up teaching there at one point at the Academy. And then he had some other schools that he set up himself in the Greek world where he taught people as well. If you know about Aristotle, he was very famous for educating Alexander the Great. At one point, he went to Macedonia, which I think happened in the 340s BC, and he actually set up a school there where he taught Macedonian nobility. And so he was able to, while he was there, he educated Alexander, who was, I want to say, in between kind of like what would be now middle school, high school age, were the ages that he taught him for, I want to say, 3 or 4 years. He does have a school that he has. It's a rival to what is Plato's school. It's called different names. I think the common name they'll call it sometimes is the Lyceum. It was founded about 334 BC, but actually it was a school in Athens that was actually within a temple that was called the Lyceum Temple. So sometimes they call it the Lyceum, but it had a real name. It was called the Peripatetic School, was what the Greeks called it. You can see it was around to about 86 BC, just like the other school was, the Academy. It was called the Peripatetic School because Aristotle would actually walk around the temple and he would basically talk to people or try to teach people. And peripatetic, I think, means to walk around school, basically. So it's kind of like a professor going from class to class, I guess, and teaching people. And I guess he was one of the first to do that. It is an interesting school, by the way. It is one of the first to teach different subjects, especially the scientific fields. One thing about the Lyceum, it was known for influencing a lot of theories on science, like the natural sciences and so on. And so they do think a lot of the Greek medieval science that kind of occurs later in the world were influenced by a lot of ideas within this actual school. Like you may have heard of theories like the 4 elements, which go back to Greek times. Aristotle believed that the earth was comprised of 4 elements: earth, fire, water, and of course, earth, fire, water, and what's the 4th one I'm missing? I forgot what the other one is. Earth, fire, water. I'll remember what it is later. But earth, water, air, and fire. Air. That's an air. You got air, that one. But anyway, that and the other thing, of course, he did too. That they think that the ideas of the solar system were kind of thought up by Aristotle, or at least spread later afterwards, like the geocentric model, where the belief was that the planets revolved around the Earth, but that proved to be, wrong later, because they find out later that the planets revolve around the sun. And I think other cultures believe that, like if you go to Latin America, I think the Maya and others already figured out that the planets revolve around the sun and stuff like that. But the 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire, that's something that, of course, he kind of helped to kind of popularize later. He does have different things he's known for. He was a polymath. He studied different topics. So, anything from biology, physics, zoology. He was kind of like this amateur biologist, botanist that would collect like animal and plant specimens. In fact, when Alexander the Great was conquering the East, he sent back a lot of specimens for Aristotle to study and things like that. Astronomy, metaphysics, logic, ethics, poetry, plays. He was considered one of the first critics, like criticize things, literary, whatever, music, rhetoric, government, politics. So Aristotle was considered really polymath that was maybe a genius for his time. Those are some works that he wrote. But the one on the bottom, like physics, metaphysics, you may have heard of, but Nicomachean Ethics, I think now is considered his most famous work that he developed. But like I said, a lot of these works were kind of like lecture notes or something like that that he, I guess, he used to teach his students. They had other Greek philosophers, like during the Hellenistic period, you've got like the Cynics, that kind of cynicism that was popular. like Diogenes, you may have heard of him as well. The Epicureans, like Epicurus, was also famous as well. And then also Stoicism is popular. That was spread by the Greek philosopher Zeno as well. So they did have other philosophers that came later that were kind of popular in the Greek world. And I know the Stoic philosophers like Zeno influenced the Greeks a lot, not the Greeks, the Romans a lot. The Romans were kind of influenced by them. Like Marcus Aurelius, if you know about that, was kind of like a Stoic philosopher, etc. Now, let me get to next and talk about the Greek gods. I'll kind of just spend a few minutes discussing mythology among the Greek gods. Yeah, the Greeks had a lot of gods, like hundreds of thousands of gods that they worshiped that were popular. The ones that were the most popular were the so-called Olympians. Were called sometimes the so-called 12 Olympians, or dodecatheon, I think is another term they use, which in Greek means 12 gods. And the Olympians were these race of gods that took over the earth, especially after there was a war between what were like the so-called Titans you may have heard of. The Titans were these race of huge gods that had inhabited the earth at one point. They got in a war. It was called the War of the Titans, or Titanmachy. And eventually what happened was Zeus and a bunch of these gods of the Olympians eventually took control of the earth. So you kind of see some of the gods that are there for later. Zeus, of course, the one that's the most famous, Hera, Ares, Aphrodite, Dionysus, Demeter, Hephaestus, Athena, Hermes, I guess Persephone, Poseidon, Artemis, Hades, Apollo. Those are some that are kind of famous, that are kind of well known among the Greek gods. Of course, the Olympians, they were called this because they resided on Mount Olympus, which was up in northern Greece. And of course, which is like 9,500 feet tall. And so the term Olympian has kind of evolved from that name. I think they say the Romans later don't really believe that as much, but a lot of the Greeks thought they did reside there at one point. You can see Mount Olympus, which is at the top right in that picture. And of course, Zeus, was the one that was the most important god. That's the one they worshiped the most, was seen as the father, great chief god of the ancient Greeks, and later the Romans as well. And it's believed that the Olympians were the children of the Titans. If you know about that, they were related to the god Kronos, which was a Greek god of agriculture. And he was a son of the two gods down below, Uranus and Gaia, also called heaven and earth, which originally be the two highest of the Titan gods that were the most important. And eventually the children of Kronos fought the Titans in that War of the Titans, defeated them and banished them, of course, to the four corners of the earth. By the way, the four gods, not the four gods, but go back here to this slide, which is right here. Zeus and his brothers, of course, he also have his sisters as well. They're important because they're the ones that will kind of divide up the earth between them after the War of the Titans. And so Zeus will end up, taking over the sky. Poseidon, takes control of the oceans, the seas. And then Hades, of course, takes control of the underworld. You've also got Hera, Hestia, and Demeter. Those are all sisters of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. They are all the children of Kronos, of course, who's also called, by the way, Saturn, sometimes by the Romans. So yeah, let me talk about Zeus first. Of course, you'll see different names for the gods. Like the Romans will often call Zeus Jupiter, and then sometimes they'll call him also Jove as well. Of course, the supreme god, of course, the Greco-Roman religions, kind of seen as the father of the gods. And he was often nicknamed the Thunder Maker. They call this because, Zeus usually brandished the weapon, which is a thunderbolt. And so Zeus was considered really to be the most powerful out of all the different gods overall. Of course, his brothers were Hades and Poseidon. They were involved, of course, in defeating Kronos and the Titans. So he's the god of the sky, god of lightning, god of thunder. I think in some cases he's also the god of justice as well. He's married, of course, in mythology to Hera. I'll get to in a second. There's the Temple of Zeus again, by the way. That's at Olympia. Of course, that was the most famous temple to Zeus, where they held the Olympics back in ancient times. But Hera, of course, was his wife. She was also his sister as well. And of course, she was known as Juno to the Romans. She's often seen as this mother goddess that's associated with things like marriage, childbirth, protector of women and the family. And so she was often honored by a lot of different cults that made her popular. Told you that also she had her own temple at Olympia, where they had the Heraean Games were held there as well. So just kind of seen as a very important goddess in the Greek-Roman world. However, you know about it, Hera and Zeus sometimes don't get along. And of course, Zeus is known for a lot of philandering, having affairs with different immortals and mortals. So he has, that's one thing about Zeus. He has a lot of children, of course. There's the Temple of Hera again, of course, that at Olympia I was talking about, probably the most famous one that was built in the Greek world at the time. Of course, you also got Poseidon as well, the brother of Zeus. He was, of course, known for brandishing a weapon too, which you see there is the trident, which is like a type of spear, looks like a pitchfork. Of course, the Romans called him Neptune. Poseidon was very important. They really consider him to be probably the second most powerful god behind Zeus, in the Greco-Roman gods and all that. God of the oceans, god of the seas. He's also known as the earth shaker because he would, cause earthquakes to occur. It's also associated with tsunamis, in ancient times. And they think that Poseidon was the one that created the horse, believe it or not. Poseidon is known for living beneath the oceans at his own palace, but he does kind of go back and forth between Mount Olympus and the ocean. But like I said, he's considered one of the most powerful gods up there with Zeus. Then you've got Hades, the brother of Zeus, and Poseidon. Hades is called different names. Sometimes they call him Pluto. He's also sometimes called Dis, believe it or not, D-I-S. But Hades is the god that got, after the War of the Titans, control of the underworld. So he quite often is called that because of that. But they sometimes think his real name is Pluto, like the planet and all that. And he was famous for being married to Persephone. You may have heard of her, who was a daughter of Zeus and Demeter. And supposedly there's a story where when Persephone would go to live with Hades in the underworld, the world would have winter. And then when she'd go to live with Demeter, they'd have springtime. So it kind of changed the seasons when she would kind of go back and forth. Yeah, he's a Greek god of wealth. He had his own weapon too, which was called the Cape of Invisibility or Cap of Invisibility. Or I think they also call it the Helm of Darkness, where you'd put it like a helmet on your head. It's like a helmet, basically, and it would make you invisible. So I guess it's kind of what it's in his left hand. You can kind of see there on the right, cap or Cape of Invisibility. Hestia was another sister, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, etc. She was known as the virgin goddess of the hearth, or what we call the fireside, where in the Greco-Roman world, they would keep this eternal flame going, which would represent the home, the family, and maybe even civilization itself. And Hestia was known as the Roman equivalent, which was Vesta. It was kind of a popular god I know during the Roman times. And she was a daughter of Cronos also as well. In fact, one of the firstborn of Cronos, you can see. And under the Romans, they had this priestesshood that was well known, that was called the Vestal Virgins, where they would tend this eternal flame. And they had to keep their virginity the whole time that they were a priestess. By the way, they think that's where, I guess, the Olympics, they have that flame that they use, that like the torch or whatever. I think kind of represented that went back to that time. Demeter was another of the, one of the sisters of Zeus, Hades, Poseidon, Hera, and Hestia, and she's associated predominantly with the harvest, like the grain crops that were grown in the Greek world. They called her also in the Roman equivalent, which was Ceres as well. She was also associated with fertility, you can see, and she does appear a lot in a lot of Homeric hymns and stories about her, especially her and her daughter Persephone, which I kind of mentioned about earlier. But that's basically kind of like the brothers and sisters that were kind of the children, of course, of the god Kronos that I was talking about. Let me get into the children of Zeus. They were kind of famous, which he does have a lot of children that are well known. Of course, one of the first you see there is the goddess Athena, who the Romans had equivalent, which is Minerva. And of course, we've talked about her a lot before. She's the main patron goddess of Athens, associated with things like war and peace, but also the arts. She's kind of considered like a goddess associated with knowledge and wisdom, and also believed to be the god that gave the Greeks the olive tree, which they used to make into olive oil and use as a food source. And I think in mythology, if you read about her, there's a story where she sprang from Zeus's forehead, where he had this horrible headache, and she popped out, and that's how she was supposedly born. And she is one of three virgin goddesses, of course, in the Greek Greco-Roman pantheon. I think they call her sometimes the gray-eyed virgin. A lot of times she appears as a hoplite soldier, what you see on that right, that replica statue of her. And usually she's holding in her hand the goddess Nike, of course, the goddess of victory, also called Victoria by the Romans. So very popular god, of course, in the Greek world. Apollo, very popular Greek god, of course, son of Zeus as well. He's associated with a lot of different things. He doesn't really have another name. Usually the Romans called him Apollo as well. But he was associated with a lot of things, mostly the god of the sun, main thing, but also the god of light, the god of knowledge, poetry, music, prophecy, and truth. And there were various temples throughout Greece that were kind of famous for being associated with Apollo. The two most famous was on the island of Delos, supposedly where he was born. And then Delphi in Boeotia was the most famous, where they had the Oracle of Delphi, Pythia, that was there, priestess, who could tell your prophecy, like your future. But if she did, it would be in a riddle, and you had to figure it out. Usually Apollo was symbolized with a golden bow and arrow, and he would also be, playing a stringed instrument like the lyre, of course. And the Romans have an equivalent to him later that's kind of similar to him called Helios. I think they call it also as well, which is kind of like a sun god. So it's kind of similar to Apollo, kind of seen as an equivalent. Hermes or Mercury, another son of Zeus, who, of course, was very famous in the Greek world. A lot of planets are named after a lot of these Greek gods we're talking about, like Mercury, of course, for Hermes. Hermes was often associated with different things. Commerce, because a lot of merchants would basically worship him for luck in business. But money, you can see luck also in fortune, kind of be part of that. A lot of athletes and thieves would actually worship Hermes because you got to be quick, like Hermes. Hermes was known for having wings on his helmet and wings on his feet. And he was basically Zeus's messenger god, kind of eyes and ears about what's going on in the world. In fact, the word merchant is derived from the word Mercury, they say. Artemis or Diana, another famous, of course, daughter of Zeus. She, of course, is often associated with hunting. So just known as the virgin huntress. So she's kind of considered this god that hunters, I guess, would kind of worship for good luck for hunting. So a goddess of the hunt, wilderness, a goddess associated with animals, but also kind of seen as a protector of children and also, I guess, of women's childbirth and things like that. And it's a type of god that supposedly only comes out at night. But Apollo and Artemis, if you know about, are twin brothers and sisters related to each other. Then you have Aphrodite or Venus as well, which is the Roman equivalent. Of course, Aphrodite is known as the famous goddess associated with things like beauty and love, of course, with fertility. And she was considered to be the most beautiful of the Greek goddesses, especially from statues that are kind of shown on the Greco-Roman world. Remember correctly, that was part of why they say the so-called Trojan War started because of the whole issue with Paris and Helen. Eros, also known as Cupid, the god of erotic love, which is kind of behind her, that was her son. And if you know about him, he was born from her relationship with Ares or Mars, who was her lover. And then she was actually married to Hephaestus or Vulcan. So it's kind of like a big scandal, in Greek mythology, her having, of course, a lover with Ares or Mars. There's, of course, been a lot of statues made of, Aphrodite, which I guess the most famous is the one on the right, Venus de Milo, that was found, I want to say, in the 1920s on one of the Greek islands in the Aegean. And that's considered the most famous statue. There's other ones on the left, so I think that's more of a Roman statue of Aphrodite. But a lot of statues, she's kind of depicted as being, real beautiful. Ares or Mars, of course, another famous god in Greek mythology. Of course, Ares or Mars is the god of war. Of course, everybody's heard of him, brother of Athena or Minerva. He basically was not as popular with the Greeks. Most people don't know that. They're kind of ambivalent, I think, towards Ares, but the Romans kind of revered him more. They kind of saw Mars as being more important, more dignified, and they even thought some of their early rulers like Romulus and Remus were related back to the god Mars, and so he was really appreciated more within the Roman world compared to the Greek one. But like I said, Ares or Mars was supposedly the lover of Aphrodite or Venus, and then, of course, the father of Eros and Cupid in a lot of mythology in ancient Greece. Of course, most depictions of Ares or Mars, he usually looks like a soldier, like a hoplite or a gladiator or some kind of Roman soldier. Hephaestus or Vulcan is another famous Greek god that's well known, god of fire, metallurgy, artisans. He's considered like the so-called blacksmith of the gods. And Hephaestus or Vulcan was known for being one of those gods that made weapons for a lot of the Greek gods, weapons for like maybe Achilles and other famous Greek mythological characters like maybe Perseus or something like that. So he is kind of known for that. He was a son of Zeus and Hera. One thing about Hephaestus, he was very famous for being lame. What I mean by that, he would kind of limp around, which I think was from a fall, where he had fallen and hurt himself. And supposedly he was very ugly, very grotesque looking. And so the ugliest god was married to the most beautiful woman, the goddesses, which was Aphrodite. Usually symbolized by an anvil and hammer with tongs, I think is what it is. And so he's kind of known for forging a lot of weapons and other kind of implements in the Greek world, but associated with also fire as well. So Vulcan is the equivalent to the Romans. And you have one more god I'll talk about too that was famous, Dionysus, also known as Bacchus. He's a very important god in a lot of Greco-Roman cults and so on. And of course, associated with things like wine and winemaking, fertility. Dionysus was big into a lot of festivals, the putting on of plays in theaters and things like that. And I know in the Greek world, especially in Attica, in Athens, they did have the famous Dionysia, which was a famous festival that they would have. The Romans had kind of an equivalent, the Bacchanalia also as well. And so Dionysus was a real popular guy. They say that's part of why a lot of religions later, like Christianity, Judaism, have wine, grape juice or whatever being used in a lot of ceremonies because of the importance of wine in a lot of the temples in ancient Greece a long time ago. That's a statue that was made back in the Renaissance by Michelangelo. I think it's called just Dionysus, is the name of the statue. It does have the god Pan behind him, which Pan was the god of the flocks. Panic, I think they call it, where it comes from the term panic. He's that goat god that kind of plays like a flute, basically. So those are some of the chief gods that are kind of well known, of course, in Greek mythology. They had hundreds and hundreds of gods that, of course, the Greeks worshipped, and of course the Romans had equivalent or gods that they kind of adopted over time. But over time the Romans had other gods they brought in, like even Persian gods like Mithras that they had. And then if you know about it, the Romans eventually went to Christianity and banned all those gods, of course, over time. I think there's even a case where you have some people that even brought back some of the gods now. I think there's some case of some people trying to bring back paganism and things like that. But a lot of it's been stamped out over time, with the ancient Greco-Roman gods. Before I go, I will kind of mention this. I'll have an upcoming second exam. Of course, I don't know when I'm going to probably release that. Might be over the weekend, but I know until Monday at least, I'll probably have it up for you eventually. I am kind of working on a review for the second exam, where I'll kind of review over some of the study guide questions. If you go in the back of all the PowerPoint lectures I've got for you, there'll be a bunch of study guide questions that I have on each one of those. I'll kind of review those probably in a recorded video for you later. So I'm going to probably do that. I'll kind of blow that up so you can see it right for later, right there. But I'll probably have I think next week too, I'll have a recorded lecture that I'm going to have on Alexander the Great and his conquests, which like I said, it's going to be based off of some type of probably, I want to say like a bonus type quiz I'll have on that for extra credit. So it looks like we did have a few students I know earlier. Avriel came in early. Hey, what's going on, Avriel? Also Becky, also as well. And then also looks like, Marissa had to leave early, but anyway. But it looks like I don't have any historical questions. But if you do have any comments, questions about this lecture or any of the other lectures, do let me know, of course, either on Canvas or, of course, with these videos as well. Like I said, I'll be posting later, probably in the next few days, I'll get that up for you, some kind of review, of course, for the upcoming second exam. So y'all have a great rest of the week coming up, and of course weekend. Hey, Sean also as well. Y'all have a great rest of the week overall, and that's pretty much it for today. So y'all take care. I'll see you, of course, later.